Yeah, we did.
This is a big version of what you have on the handout, and we got through the first 3 sections last week. Without looking at your paper, if you were here last week, does anyone try to name them? Beginnings. And the symbol for the circle of the beginnings is to remind us how God created the world. During the beginnings, we've got creation. God created everything, and then we had the fall in the garden with Adam and Eve. And then after the fall, we had the first family, Cain and Abel. Sibling rivalry taken to the nth degree, right? And then we had the flood. The only man found righteous among those who were living at the time was Noah. But God didn't just save Noah, He also saved yes.
An animal.
We take in animals, that's true. So we love our animals and we love our family and that sort of thing. But did that take care of the sin problem?
No.
Because where's the sin problem?
In us.
The heart, the human heart, is desperately wicked. And mankind corrupted again. And the tower, remember the story about the tower? God had told, since Adam, God had said, fill the earth, be fruitful and multiply. In other words, spread out and fill the whole earth, because the goal God has is in Habakkuk 2, that the whole earth would be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the sea covers, as the waters cover the sea. And instead of spreading out, what did they do? They grouped together in a single city and they sought to build a tower up to heaven. They wanted to make a name for themselves. And the funny thing, the humor in that story is that God came down from heaven to take a look at their tower that they thought was reaching to heaven. And He said, you know, if I don't do something about this, there's no telling what they can get up to. So He confused their language. And they were forced to spread by those who spoke the same language groups. So God had to make them do what He told them to do all along. That's the beginnings. The next is the patriarchs. The symbol for the patriarchs, so you remember why I gave you that little crook?
Shepherd.
They were all shepherds. They all herdsmen. It's probably, they prefer the term herdsman. That sounds more manly, doesn't it? God created the whole world, and so in the beginnings we're looking on a global level, and then He narrows down and He picks one man. He didn't say, where are the Jews? I want to pick a Jew. There were no Jews, right? They were all just one race. He picked Abraham and what's the word? Initiated a covenant with him. Do you remember what God promised in the covenant? What was the promise?
He would multiply him and make him the father of many nations.
That's true. That's a big part of it. And remember, man had tried to make his name great. God told Abraham, I will make your name great. That's something God gets to do. And He promised them land, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. So people, blessing, and land. He said, I'll bless you and bless all the nations through you, and I will give you a land of your own. He had a son named Isaac. He had to go a long way around the corner to have Isaac. Remember, we had to take a detour through Ishmael. They got impatient waiting on God's promise. Of course, it did take, 25 years. But, so by way of Ishmael, they end up with Isaac. Isaac becomes the keeper of the promise. Isaac has 2 children, remember? Twins. Jacob and Esau. And Jacob is the one that God chose to work through. Esau sold his birthright to his brother Jacob. And Jacob has a character trait. I want to see if you remember his character trait. It's not necessarily a good one. No, he's a liar. He's a trickster too. He is always working everything to his advantage. He's deceptive is what he is. That's the word for it. But God chose to use him anyway, which is good news again, because we're all broken, fallen people as well, and God can use us. And he didn't just have 2 sons, he had 12. 2 wives, 2 concubines, 12 sons. It's a big family. Those 12 sons, of course, become the 12 tribes of Israel. And then after we moved from the patriarchs to Egypt, but do we know how we got to Egypt? How did God's people get to Egypt? Joseph first. Joseph got sold into slavery by his brothers. And they sold him into slavery, and he got taken off by Potiphar in Egypt. And got into trouble right off the bat. He was just too good looking for his own good. Potiphar's wife decided he was very good looking, and when he rejected her, she cried rape, and he ended up in jail. But God blessed him there. He ended up getting out of jail by discerning, by being able to tell Pharaoh his dream, and Pharaoh rose him up to the highest place in the land, highest position, and famine came, just like he had foretold in Pharaoh's dream. But Joseph had a great plan for keeping people alive, and it brought his family to Egypt because they were starving. He got to reunite with his brothers. He got to move his whole family into Egypt.
And then in a very nice place in Egypt.
Goshen. Goshen was a very fertile place. The Egyptians detested shepherds. They thought it was just a terribly unclean business. So Pharaoh's like, okay, give them Goshen. I don't have to smell them. Like way back 40. Well, so that's where we ended up in Egypt. Joe got him in. Mo's going to get him out. Joe got him in. Mo's going to get him out. So while they were in Egypt, there were 70 of them. The whole family, Jacob's whole family, it comprised 70 people. And they did very well there. They did very, very well there. They went from 70 to about 600,000. So that whole thing about be fruitful and multiply, they took it seriously. God was making a great nation out of Abraham, just like he promised he would. So that brings us to the next section, which is Exodus. He got him in, now he's got to get him out. And the symbol for Exodus, if I know why I did that, the two curved red lines? Part of the Red Sea. Part of the Red Sea, that's it. Very clever, huh? So, we're into the Exodus. All right, they did very well. God blessed his people. They multiplied. And not only did they multiply, but Egypt was blessed through God's people. First through Joseph, right? And then these people who did very well. It was, what was good for God's people turned out to be good for Egypt as well. But I didn't pull out Bibles. Okay. Mike, would you go grab a handful of Bibles?
Sure, really?
In Frankie's office on the back bookcase. I'm sorry, I should have got Bibles out.
I have my phone.
I'll try to grab the other people. I got mine. Renee, go ahead and look up Exodus chapter 1.
Can you
Get mine on my phone.
Okay, Exodus 1. I'm going to read the first 19 verses in just a minute. So if you got a Bible or if you got one on your phone and you want to read along, it's Exodus 1. But here's the Bibles are coming. And Mike, you don't need to bring all of them, just a handful. Not everybody will want to look at them. Yeah, most people got their phones, so.
Excuse me, what was the Bible verse?
Exodus 1. You got one right next to you, Doug. Okay. Renee's going to read to us the first 19 verses.
Israel increases greatly in Egypt.
Okay, read next one.
These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali, Gad, Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh's store cities, Pythons and Rames?
Ramses.
What is that?
Ramses.
So basically the same.
Oh, okay. But the more they were opposed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, the ruthless made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shipar, and the other, Huba, okay.
Something like that, I can't remember. Doesn't matter, go ahead.
Who serve as midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stool. If it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwives said to the Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them.
All right, so they made them slaves. They were afraid of them. They were so numerous, they said, if they turn on us, we're goners. And so they turned them into slaves. Now, who's picturing in their mind the Charlton Heston movie, with the mud pits? Remember the mud pits, where they're tramping the straw down into the mud to make the bricks. And there's another story in the Bible about a crazy king who wanted to make sure the male children all got killed. Remember that? Herod, remember when he said all the male children under the age of 2? But Jesus was spared, and there was a baby spared in this episode as well. Moses was one of the male Hebrew children, and he was spared by these wonderful midwives who were very clever. And he ends up being rescued by Pharaoh's daughter and raised in Pharaoh's own household. Pharaoh's scared of these people, and he ends up raising their deliverer right under his nose, which is kind of ironic and humorous at the same time. So, when he gets to be about 40 years old, he learns about his Hebrew heritage. And he sees an Egyptian servant mistreating a Hebrew, and these are his people. All of a sudden he cares, right? And he kills the Egyptian. And he has to flee into the desert to save his life because he's done this thing. So he ends up in the desert taking care of flocks, and about 40 years later, he has an encounter with God. What did God use to get Moses' attention? Burning bush. And he told him, take your sandals off because you're standing on holy ground. And he communicates with him, and he introduces himself to Moses in a way that he can understand. He goes, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, he's going to know those names if he knows anything about his Hebrew heritage. But he said, and God says, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh because I want him to let my people go. And one of the first questions Moses asks is, well, when they ask me what your name is, what do I say? What do I give them to call you? And God says, I am. The Hebrew word actually says, I exist. And it's funny because Moses asked for a noun and he gets a verb. And that's very appropriate for God because he's a God of action. He's always doing and giving and creating. So God sends him to Pharaoh to say, let my people go. Moses really squawks. He doesn't want to do it. He says, I can't, I'm not a good speaker. And so God lets him take his brother Aaron with him. So the two of them go to Pharaoh and say, let God's people go. And Pharaoh says, no. In fact, it's human. If you go back and read the story, God lets him know ahead of time. You're going to go ask him to let my people go, and he's going to say no. I'm going to harden his heart. And he's going to say no. So it's like I'm setting you up for failure? No, God's got a bigger plan. So God has to convince Pharaoh to let his people go, and what does he do? 10 plagues. 10 plagues. First the water turns into blood. All fish die. Then the frogs. Then the gnats. Think about no-see-ums, and that would just be unbearable.
Well, even just gnats flying all over.
I know. Flies. But God made a distinction with this plague. There were no flies in Goshen, just in the rest of Egypt. God separated his people. Gave them a break. Next was all the Egyptian livestock died, not the Hebrew, but the Egyptian livestock died. Then there were boils on both man and beast. I've never had a boil, I hope I never have one. I understand it's not pleasant. Then there was fiery hail from the sky, not in Goshen, but over the rest of Egypt. And after the hail destroyed, you can imagine what that would have done to the crops, whatever was left. Does anybody remember the next one? Locusts. Sends locusts to just eat everything inside. And that's, I mean, that alone would just be devastating. But then the next one was darkness. For 3 days it was dark. Kind of foreshadows again. Jesus is 3 days in the tomb maybe. But there's 3 days of darkness. And it's interesting, we haven't covered the 10th one yet, that's just the first 9. Each of these plagues is actually a teaching of the battle between God and evil, because every one of these plagues, represented one of Egypt's gods, one of their pagan false gods. They had a god of frogs, and they had a god of flies. They did, and so God is purposely tearing down their idols one at a time with these plagues. You worship the water, I can turn it to blood. You worship the sun, I can blot it out for 3 days. God's in control. He's making a big statement here. He's saying, I am God. One God. The 10th plague, of course, was the worst of all. It was the death of the firstborn. And God told his children, the Israelites, on this night, I want you indoors. Do not leave your home until you're told to. And there was a special sign they were supposed to put on their homes as well. Do you remember what that was? The blood of the Lamb. What God was actually instituting this night was the Passover. This was going to be one of the great feasts of Israel. He said, I want you to take a perfect, spotless lamb, sacrifice it, take that blood, mark your doorpost, and then eat the meal. Eat the lamb with your family. Keep your shoes on. It's like have your coat ready, your purse on your arm, because you're out of here very soon. They ate unleavened bread because they didn't want to take time to have it rise. God was communicating to them through this meal, which they were going to end up reenacting year after year after year, which they still do today. And when the angel of death came, the angel of death passed over the Israelites' homes. He saw the blood of the Lamb, and death passed them over. Now that's just symbolism all over the place, isn't it? What do I say at the Eucharist when I have the host up above my head? Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast. It's the Passover feast all over again. We're celebrating it every Sunday. Just goosebumps. So, again, they were to do this every year as a remembrance of God's deliverance of his people out of Egypt. That his power over all of the forces that wanted to keep them enslaved. So Pharaoh finally, the death of his firstborn, that was it. Pharaoh said, go, just go. And they had to leave quickly. But they didn't go empty-handed. You might remember what happened?
Because they got everything, all the gold and...
They asked their Egyptian neighbors, and they were like, take it, just take it. So they basically plundered Egypt on their way out. They had all this booty to take with them. And they get as far as the Red Sea, and Pharaoh changes his mind, to no surprise. What was I thinking? Go get him. He sends his troops and his chariots after them. They catch up to him at the Red Sea, but God parts the waters, and they pass through on dry land. And then when the Egyptian army follows them, the waters come in and kill them all. Pharaoh sought to kill the Hebrew children by drowning them in the Nile. He ends up having his troops drown in the Nile, doesn't he? Kind of revisited it on himself. So we can read all about the Exodus in Exodus chapters 12 through 15.
What do you mean by the Exodus? The exit from
Exit, exactly. I mean, like when they exited from Egypt.
Okay.
So, Joe got him in, Mo got him out. Any questions about the Exodus before we move on? I mean, there's, I'm sure, lots of questions, but I think I covered that was not clear. The next one is the wilderness. He's gotten them out of Egypt and they're headed into the wilderness. These are clever colored. And what I'm drawing here will make more sense when I draw it over here. Ten Commandments. Y'all are good. Y'all are good.
That's right.
Oh, two stones.
2 stone tablets. And you can read about the wilderness in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In fact, Sarah, you might want to read this one. Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 through 8. Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 through 8.
On the first day of the 3rd month, after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before all of them the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord.
Less true words were never spoken. We will do everything the Lord has said. So, it's about 50 days after they've left Egypt, and they make it to Mount Sinai, and God's presence, that's where the burning bush was on Mount Sinai. And God's presence is still there, and Moses goes up, and God enters into a covenant agreement with his people that he's called out to himself. It's called the Sinaitic covenant, because it was made at Mount Sinai. And it's a conditional covenant. If you'll do these things, then this will be the result. There was no condition involved with Abraham's covenant. I'm going to do this, period. I'm going to make you a great name. I'm going to make you a great people. I'm going to give you a land. All the world will be blessed through you. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. That's what God's going to do. But this was a conditional one. They had to obey his words. What the covenant said is he wanted to make them his treasured possession. What do you think he meant by that?
You wanted to make them upright and holy, maybe?
Treasured possession. Well, they would uniquely be his people. And as we're going to see, his presence was going to be with them. Out of all the nations on the earth, he was choosing this nation to work through. Now keep in mind, his ultimate goal, like we said in Habakkuk 2, was that the knowledge of the glory of the Lord would cover the earth like the waters cover the sea. He was going to work through the nation of Israel to communicate his greatness, his power, and his love to the rest of the world. But he was starting with them. They were supposed to be his missionaries, his ambassadors. So, they were going to be special, God's chosen people, treasured possession. He wanted them to be a kingdom of priests. What do you think that means? What is that? It certainly speaks of holiness. Priests worship, right? I mean, that's kind of their job.
They teach.
They teach, they lead worship, but he wants them all to be worshiping people. He doesn't want to have, he's going to institute the priesthood pretty soon. But it's not just the job of the priest to worship. Like somebody said, they lead the worship. He wants them to all be worshipers. the whole nation of people. And lastly, he wants them to be a holy nation. And certainly, Sarah, that filters in through all three of them. But he specifically says he wants them to be a holy nation because he's a holy God. So they need to be a holy people if they're going to reveal him to the rest of the world. And the way he's going to help them understand what all of this means is by giving them the 10 Commandments. Now, when I got to seminary, I was challenged to know the 10 Commandments, and I didn't. And I was very embarrassed that I was at seminary and I didn't know the 10 Commandments. I thought that's pretty awful. So I had this wonderful professor who had this totally silly way of teaching. Sarah's heard it, Renee's heard it. Totally silly way of remembering the 10 Commandments. But it has worked because I was in seminary like 20 years ago and I still remember it. So I'm going to share it with you, and if you like it and you want to learn it, I can give you a copy. But it's so easy. Number 1, there's only one God. It's pretty easy, right? One God. 2, remember these are silly, okay? 2, think about a light switch. It's got 2 positions, right?
I don't know.
Imagine that light switch was attached to an idol, and you flip the switch and it goes, no idols. You shall have no idols. 3, think of a 3-legged stool with a weather vane. Thou shalt not take the Lord thy God's name in vain. I've got these written down so you don't have to write them down. That's number 3. Number 4, 4 wheels on a car. You drive your car where on Sunday? Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Number 4. 5, you got 5 fingers on your hand, and when you're little, you always have to hold your mom and dad's hand when you walk. Honor your father and your mother. 6, thou shalt not kill. Think about a 6-shooter. It's going to get really silly here. 7, thou shalt not commit adultery. There is nothing lucky about getting lucky. You're going to remember it. You'll remember that one. 8, thou shalt not steal. And you picture an octopus with 8 arms stealing. 9, thou shalt not bear false witness. You shouldn't lie. And say you're bowling. You said you bowled a strike, but you only got 9 pins, so you lied. Or you bowled 9 rounds of golf and you lied about your score. That's 9. 10, thou shalt not covet. And 10 fingers, grasping, wanting. That's how you remember the 10 Commandments. It works. It works. It works for me. It really did. So, like I said, I suggest for each of you to learn the 10 Commandments. And if you want to, I've got it right here. You can make a copy. My professor. My professor.
And where did you learn it from?
I don't know. I don't know. I also, if you're more of a poetic soul, I found this. This is really lovely. And you can memorize this. This is the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt have no gods but me. Unto no image bow the knee. Take not the name of God in vain. Do not the Sabbath day profane. Honor thy father and thy mother too. And see that thou no murder do. From foul adultery keep thou clean. Steal not, though thy state be mean. Bear not false witness, shun that blot. What is thy neighbor's, covet not. You can make copies. But, you know, we're Christians. We should know the 10 Commandments. Yes. All right. So, God taught his people what it would mean to be his people. These are the boundaries for your life. And each one of these commandments communicates something about God himself. And we could spend a lot of time on that. But the next thing he did was he told them to build a tabernacle. He gave all the plans and the details, and they were very specific, to Moses to build a tabernacle, which was a portable temple. It was one that could go with them as they went through the wilderness. And in the tabernacle, there was an inner part called the Holy of Holies. So what God is teaching his people through these 10 Commandments and through this tabernacle is that there's holiness and then there's sin, and there's a separation between the two. The law, you don't know what sin is until the law tells you it's a sin. Like, think about a small child wants something and grabs it from somebody else. It doesn't belong to them. They don't know that's wrong. They just know that they want it. And you say, no, 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 that's wrong. And they learn that that's a sin. Well, that's what these laws do. They teach us God's commandments, God's requirements. And then the tabernacle made it very clear that there was a separation between holiness and sin, between God and sinners. Inside of that Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. And that was a symbol of God's presence for a season. It was a very important symbol, but only for a season. Not forever and ever and ever. In fact, we don't really know where the Ark of the Covenant now is. And it doesn't really matter, because where is God's presence with us now? Everywhere and within by the Holy Spirit. But this was a separate time. This was in the early days of God communicating to his people. So God taught them this sacrificial system that when you break God's commandments, when you sin, there has to be an atoning. A sacrifice has to be made, a pure and spotless sacrifice in your place, a substitute. And the priest would go into the Holy of Holies one time a year to offer atonement for the sins of the people. And the Jews still celebrate this event every year called Yom Kippur. It means Day of Atonement. Yom Kippur, it's a very high holy day for them. So, he was going to need priesthood. So that's the next thing he did, he established the priesthood. He took Aaron, who was of the tribe of Levi, along with Moses, and he established the priesthood through Aaron. Aaron was the first priest, and all of his descendants would be priests. And they had specific clothing. Remember, they had on their breastplate, they had the 12 stones with the names of the 12 tribes. On their shoulders, they had 2 huge stones with 6 tribe names on each. And they had a turban on their head with a gold, you know how heavy gold is? With a gold strap that said, Holy unto the Lord. Now try to imagine putting that on. There'd be a lot of weight involved, right? And that was intentional. The weight of the responsibility. They carried a tremendous responsibility by mediating God's presence to the people. And they were constantly to be aware of the weight of that responsibility, as well as the weight of the sin of the people that was being atoned for. So it was all very intentional. The job of the priest was to offer sacrifices for the people, to pray for the people, and to teach them the law. That was their job. And in a sense, I mean, I'm not anywhere like an Old Testament priest. We don't slaughter anything back there, thank God. But I do help you with sacrifices in the fact that I celebrate Eucharist for you every week. We're remembering the sacrifice of Christ. I pray for you faithfully, and I try to teach you the law. So, in a sense, we're still trying to carry that out. So, they had a sacrificial system to take care of their sin before a holy God, and it was good because they were going to need it. Because not long after all of this, the golden calf incident. Moses went up to the mountain to speak with God, and he was gone for 40 days, and the people got nervous and restless. They weren't used to worshiping a God they couldn't see. They'd been living in Egypt, and Egypt was a pagan land, and they had adopted a lot of their religious beliefs, and they were used to worshiping a God they could actually see. So when Moses was gone, they decided to make a god, a golden calf. And it got ugly quick. They got out of hand. And anyway, they made it to Canaan. Let me get my words together. It really wasn't a very long distance from Egypt to the Promised Land. It's about 250 miles. They could have made it in a month. And they did. They made it there. Actually, it was about a year. It took them about a year to get from Egypt to Canaan. And when they got there, between time, God had to provide for them. I mean, they had provisions when they left, but those ran out eventually. So God had to feed his people and give them water. Does anybody remember how that worked? Manna from heaven, water from the rock, quail. They decided they needed meat, so he provided quail. He even had a GPS system for them. They had, the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. He had, all their needs were met. I found this amazing thing. I don't know how true this is. But it says at this point, there were about 2 million of them together following Moses, and that amount of people would need 2,000 tons of food a day. They would need about 4,000 tons of firewood to cook and to keep warm. They would need about 11 million gallons of water. They're in the desert. And then crossing the Red Sea. That number of people to cross through a narrow path would have taken days. So it would have been a very broad passage. Anyway, it just highlights the miracle of God's provision for his people in the wilderness, because that was a large group of people and a lot of mouths to feed. A whole lot of mouths to feed. So they finally make it to the promised land, and Moses picks 12 spies and says, you guys go and check it out and come back and tell us what it looks like over there before we cross over. It's only been a year. And he sends 12 spies, and they all come back, and 10 of them say, looks great. Got a bunch of great produce and food, but there's a lot of really scary people. And they're not going to go easily. They're not going to let us just come camp out. They're going to oppose us. We're going to have a battle. But 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, said, but God's with us. We got this. God sent us. He's provided for us all this time. He's going to take care of us. Well, who did the people listen to? The negative report. And they started to panic, and they decided they wanted to go back to Egypt.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So, God decided they really weren't ready to enter the promised land. They weren't ready to take the land. So he sent them back into the wilderness, and they wandered for about 40 years. I mean, it's one of the things that's often said is it took about that long to get Egypt out of them. You know, he's training them he's building them into a nation. They've got laws, they've got festivals, Passover and Tabernacle and all the other feasts. They have a system of worship. So, at the end of this time, they were, after 40 years, God had decided that that generation would not be allowed to enter the land. He was going to start with their offspring, the next generation. Only Joshua and Caleb would be allowed to enter into the promised land. That brings us to the next one, conquest. And this is going to be one of your favorite childhood stories. A sword. It's a mighty sword, isn't it? Okay. And you read about the conquest in the book of Joshua. Now, not only was the Exodus nation not allowed to enter, that generation, but Moses wasn't allowed to enter. He disobeyed God, and the consequences were he was not going to be allowed to enter into the promised land. Somebody look up and read for us Deuteronomy 34, verses 1 through 8.
How did he disobey God?
God told him to bring water forth from the rock, to speak, and the water would come out. And instead he took a rock and he struck very dramatically. He didn't obey God. And he was the leader of all of God's people, so obedience was even more important for him. So, Deuteronomy 34, verses 1 through 8.
Deuteronomy what?
34, verses 1 through 8. So you got it?
Oh, really?
Oh, okay. Ken, you got it?
Yes.
Great.
Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Mount Pisgah, east of Jericho, and there the Lord showed him the whole land, the territory of Gilead as far north as the town of Dan, the entire territory of Naphtali, the territories of Ephraim and Manasseh, the territory of Judah as far west as the Mediterranean Sea, the southern part of Judah, and the plain that reaches from Zor to Jericho, the city of palm trees. Then the Lord said to Moses, "This is the land that I promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob I would give to their descendants. I have let you see it, but I will not let you go there." So Moses, the Lord's servant, died there in the land of Moab, as the Lord had said he would. The Lord buried him in a valley in Moab, opposite the town of Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows the exact place of his burial. Moses was 120 years old when he died. He was as strong as ever, and his eyesight was still good. The people of Israel mourned him for 30 days in the plains of Moab.
Who buried Moses? God himself. Oh my gosh. Isn't that amazing? I mean, God called him his friend. And he spoke with him almost face to face, and yet, of course, he was disobedient and there were consequences, but he didn't stop loving him. I mean, when he died, he buried him himself, and it's a beautiful picture. Well, Joshua was raised up to replace Moses. He was going to be the next leader. So somebody read Joshua 1 through 9. Shouldn't be very far away.
Moses, the servant of the Lord, died. After that, the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun. Joshua was Moses' helper. The Lord said to Joshua, "My servant Moses is dead. Now then, I want you and all these people to get ready to go across the Jordan River. I want all of you to go into the land I am about to give to the people of Israel. I will give all of you every place you walk on, just as I promised Moses. Your territory will reach from the Negev desert all the way to Lebanon. The great Euphrates River will be to the east, and the Mediterranean Sea will be to the west. Your territory will include all the Hittite country." How far did you say read?
To 9.
Joshua, no one will be able to stand up against you as long as you live. I will be with you just as I was with Moses. I will never leave you. I will never desert you. Be brave and strong. You will lead these people, and they will take the land as their very own. It is the land I promised with an oath to give their people long ago. Be strong and very brave. Make sure you obey the whole law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn away from it to the right or to the left. Then you will have success everywhere you go. Never stop reading this scroll of the law. Day and night you must think about what it says. Make sure you do everything that is written in it. Then things will go well with you, and you will have great success. Here is what I am commanding you to do. Be strong and brave. Do not be terrified. Do not lose hope. I am the Lord your God. I will be with you everywhere you go.
That's a lot of encouragement, but he needed it. And he's about to lead this huge nation of slightly rebellious people into this promised land, and they're going to face opposition. So he needed that kind of encouragement. And so they get to the border again, and they're going to send spies, but they're going to do it a little differently this time. Joshua learned from the last time. He didn't send 12, he sent 2. And he didn't let anybody know he was sending them. He sent them in secret. And that way when they came back, he alone would hear the report. The people couldn't be incited into rebellion again. You learn from your mistakes, right? So he sends 2 spies out, and he tells them to look over the land, especially Jericho, because Jericho was a mighty fortified city. It's a big city, and they wanted they were going to want to take it. When they get to Jericho, they meet a prostitute named Rahab, and she's a God-fearer. She knows about God. And she says, yeah, the people are scared to death of you. They've heard that you have a God that protects you and provides for you. So she protects them. She hides them and protects them from the king's men. And she said, when you come and take the city, please spare me and my family. And they said they would, as long as she and her family were within the house and didn't leave it. And they put a red cord out the window to mark the house for when they came. This should be sounding similar to you. In the Exodus, when the angel of death came, they had to stay in-house, and it was marked with red. So we're seeing a very similar pattern here with Rahab. Rahab was not a Jew. She was a Gentile. But God was clearly favoring her because she had been faithful to his people. So, it's interesting, Rahab later became the wife of one of those 2 spies, Salmon. And Salmon and Rahab gave birth to a child named Boaz. Remember Boaz? Yes. Who married Ruth, who became the parents of the grandfather of David. who of course became the ancestor of Jesus. It's very cool. So she enters into the genealogy of Jesus because of her faithfulness. So they get a good report from the spies. They're ready to go into the land. They got to cross the River Jordan. It's at flood stage. And God, again, parts the waters so they can come through. Now, it's a practical thing, but there's a symbolic thing as well. Because God has told Joshua, I'm going to be with you just as I was with Moses. Now he's communicating to the people, see, I led you through the waters of the Red Sea by parting it for Moses. I'm doing the same thing for Joshua. I'm still with you. Different leader, same God. So, they go through. It's interesting, I got this from a book Cheryl shared with me. The first time the Israelites approached the Promised Land was from the South Desert. All they had to do was walk in. 40 years later, when they get to the Promised Land, they come from a different point, and they come to the Jordan River at flood stage, and they have to pass through. In other words, it's easier the first time you obey. Things usually go better if you just go ahead and obey the first time. Now, they crossed over into the Promised Land, and the first thing they do is they circumcise all the males. That communicates a whole lot right there. Because God set the whole circumcision thing way back with Abraham. And these people have not been faithful. They've been in Egypt for 400 years. And even in the wilderness, they were not circumcising their children. So they had to circumcise. And it's a reminder to us that God's covenants must be renewed with every generation. God doesn't have any grandchildren. You can raise your child to know and love the Lord, but until that child owns it for themselves, it's only the way they were raised, which is what confirmation is all about for Sarah Sunday. She was raised to know and love the Lord. Her parents were very faithful to do that, but she's now ready to stand and claim that for herself, which is what confirmation is all about. And it's a very cool thing.
Can't wait.
So as soon as they did this, as soon as they made this sign of faithfulness, the man stopped. Because they were in the Promised Land now, the land of milk and honey, no more manna. The angel of the Lord comes and appears to Joshua, and he tells him, take off your sandals, because the ground that you are standing on is holy ground. Just like the burning bush with Moses. In fact, there's only 2 places in the whole Bible where that phrase is, and it's when Moses at the burning bush and Joshua, the angel of the Lord. So again, we're seeing all these parallels with Moses. And the angel tells him exactly how they're going to take the city of Jericho. And it must sound like nonsense. You're going to march around the city one time with the Ark of the Covenant, blowing trumpets. You're going to do that for 6 days. Now, the marching around the city wasn't totally ridiculous because that was a symbol of laying siege to a city. That would be a sign that you were laying siege. But they did it for 6 days, which might have seemed a little excessive. The 7th day, they went around the city 7 times. And when they blew the trumpets, all the people shouted, and what happened? Walls came tumbling down. They went in and took the city, and of course Rahab and her family were spared. So we see that God is providing His power and His presence for His people over and over and over again. And the Lord said, there's to be no plunder taken. All of the plunder from Jericho is dedicated to the Lord, because it's the first fruits of their time in the Promised Land. So they weren't supposed to take anything from themselves. They were supposed to burn everything to the ground. Okay? The next city they're going to take is Ai. And it was a little bitty place. In fact, they didn't even send all their troops. Because it should have been an easy no-brainer. And they ended up getting their tails wagged. They lost badly. And Joshua can't understand, wait a minute, we just had this incredible victory over Jericho, and we go into this little bitty city and we get beat. What's going on? He knew something was wrong, and so they sought the Lord, and the Lord explained to him it's because someone took things that were dedicated to the Lord. They took plunder from Jericho when I said no plunder. And so they sought the Lord, and they found out who did it, a man named Achan, and he was stoned. And it was very harsh and swift punishment, but if you think about it, God is trying to nip this whole rebellious disobedience right there in the bud, because this is the 2nd generation, and they're taking the Promised Land, and He wants them to succeed. So He has to deal with this very, very efficiently. So they go back and they attack Ai again and they win because they took care of the sin issue that was involved. Lots of successful battles, lots of battles. Eventually, they take the land and they have, all of the land is distributed between the 12 tribes. So God's people live there. Now, somebody turn to Joshua 21 and read verses 43 to 45. Joshua 21, verses 43 to 45.
43, 45.
Yeah, Joshua 21. Who wants to read it? Jody, you got it?
Yeah, so the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled.
That's quite a thing. All those promises to Abraham were being fulfilled. So that's where we'll stop tonight. But just a reminder, this is the goal. Beginning, God created everything, sin entered the world, sin infected every heart and every person. God raised up a man named Abraham to start a nation of people to serve him, to be holy to him, through whom he could bring a Savior. They ended up in Egypt. Joe got him in. Joseph was sold into slavery into Egypt. All of his family joined him, and they prospered there. They prospered too much. They ended up having to be rescued out of Egypt by Moses, who led them through the wilderness while God was making a nation of people, giving them laws, the tabernacle, the priesthood. They end up in the wilderness for 40 years, and then they cross into the promised land. God gives them victory over all their enemies, and they help inherit the land of milk and honey. So that's as far as we've gotten. Right there. Thank you.